Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to pull out the key insights from different sources, all focused on one topic for you, our listener.
And today, we're looking at a really significant connection.
Yeah, the deep influence of William Law, particularly his book, A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life, on John Wesley, the founder of Methodism.
There's a relationship that shaped a major religious movement. Our goal is really to help you get a clearer picture of how this happened.
Exactly. And the influence wasn't minor, was it? People noticed it even back then.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Trapp, who actually knew both men, he called Law the parent of the Methodists.
The parent, wow. Did Wesley agree with that?
Well, Wesley himself admitted there was some truth in this description, which is pretty telling.
And others echoed that sentiment later on.
They did. You have historians like Dr. Wauer calling Law the father of the English revival and the grandfather of Methodism.
Grandfather, okay.
And Evelyn Underhill saw him as Methodism's spiritual father. So yeah, these terms really hammer home just how important Law was seen to be.
Okay, so our mission today is clear. Let's unpack that. Let's pinpoint the specific ways Law, and especially A Serious Call, really molded Wesley's thinking and, well, the whole start of the Methodist movement.
Sounds good. Where should we begin? Wesley's first encounter.
Yeah, let's start there. When did Wesley first come across Law's writings?
Well, Wesley himself talks about it in his journal. He mentions that back in 1725, reading something called the Christian Pattern really stirred something in him.
Okay, 1725, what did it stir?
A deep longing, he said, to give his whole heart to God. At that point, his idea of perfection was sort of tied to this total dedication, this, rigorous attempt at holy living.
But that wasn't Law yet, was it? Or was it the main event?
That was kind of the preamble. The real turning point, the one he highlights, came a bit later in 1727.
Ah, okay. And what happened in 1727?
That's when he read Law's Christian Perfection and, crucially, A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life.
The big one.
The big one. And Wesley is very clear. Reading those books led him to a much more explicit resolution, a conscious decision to be wholly devoted to God, body, soul, spirit, the whole package.
So it wasn't just a vague feeling anymore. It was a concrete commitment sparked by Law.
Exactly, a much more defined goal.
And this stuck with him. It wasn't just a temporary enthusiasm.
Oh, definitely not. Much later, in 1738, in that famous journal entry around his Aldersgate experience, he looked back and specifically mentioned those two books by Law again.
Still citing them years later.
Yep. Underscoring their foundational impact on his earlier spiritual development.
It really sounds like Law's writing became more than just inspiration. It was almost like a practical handbook for him.
I think that's a great way to put it, especially during that critical period in Georgia.
Right. He spent time in America.
He did. And both on the voyage on the ship Simmons and while he was actually in Georgia, his journal shows him constantly referring back to Christian perfection and A Serious Call.
So he's actively using them, wrestling with the ideas.
Constantly.
Yeah.
There are frequent references. It shows how central these texts were to his thinking then.
Is there a specific example that illustrates this?
Yeah, there's an interesting story about a Mrs. Lawley. Wesley felt it was absolutely vital that she be first instructed in the nature of Christianity.
Instructed how?
According to Law's teachings. It shows you just how much Law's framework was Wesley's framework for understanding basic Christianity at that time.
Wow. So Law essentially provided the model for how Wesley thought Christianity should be understood and lived, at least initially.
It seems that way. It was definitely more than just general inspiration. Even after Aldersgate, that big turning point for him.
Yeah.
He looks back at the time just before he met Peter Buller, the Moravian, and he said he realized he had been preaching after the model of Law's two books.
So the structure, the emphasis,
Yeah.
it came from Law.
That's what he suggests, a deep practical influence on how he approached faith and how he taught it.
Okay, this leads us perfectly into A Serious Call itself. What were the key ideas in that book that resonated so strongly?
Well, at its absolute core, A Serious Call is this incredibly powerful argument that being a Christian isn't just about showing up for services.
Right. It's more encompassing.
Way more. It's about dedicating your entire life, every single part of it, to God. Law was really passionate about this idea of intentionality.
Intentionality, meaning?
Meaning you have to consciously intend to please God in everything you do. And you have to actively strive for what he called Christian perfection. It wasn't optional.
He pushes that hard in the book.
Oh, yeah. especially early on, like in chapters 2 and 3. He argues that you need this full intention, this unwavering aim in all your actions. And he warns that it's actually dangerous not to aim for eminence and piety.
Dangerous not to aim high.
Right, just sort of drifting along religiously. That wasn't enough for Law. The desire to please God had to soak into your everyday life.
So it's about breaking down that wall between Sunday morning and Monday morning.
Exactly. Integrating it all. Chapter 4 really digs into this, how your job, your daily work, needs to align with your faith.
How so?
Law basically says all Christians are devoted to holiness by definition. So even mundane tasks, common work, should be done for God's glory.
Can you give an example he uses?
He gives this quite striking example of slaves serving their masters with singleness of heart, as if they were serving Christ directly. And the implication is clear. If they should do that, then every other profession, no matter how ordinary it seems, should be approached with that same level of, devout intention.
That is radical, making every job a sacred duty, in a sense.
It really was. And he doesn't stop there. Chapter 6 tackles money and possessions.
Always a tricky subject. What was Law's take?
Pretty straightforward. Use your estate, your fortune, responsibly and religiously. Avoid vanity, avoid luxury.
And channel it towards
religious purposes, towards charity. It's about seeing wealth not just as yours, but as something to be used for God.
a very disciplined view of finances.
Yes. And he makes it concrete with a character named Miranda in chapter 9.
A fictional example.
Yeah, she's presented as the ideal. She expresses her devotion through constant charity, simplicity in dress, avoiding all kinds of vanity. She lives out the principles.
Like a case study within the book.
Kind of, yeah. Then in chapter X, Law broadens it out again. He insists that everyone, regardless of their rank or job, is obliged to live this holy life.
No exceptions.
None. He stresses that it's the inward devotion, the sincere commitment to God that counts, not just going through outward motions. A soldier, a merchant, they're just as called to devotion as a priest.
A very democratic call to holiness, then.
You could say that. It's universal. Yeah. And finally, in chapter 11, he talks about the payoff, really.
What is this?
The deep peace and genuine happiness that come from a life truly dedicated to God. He contrasts it sharply with the ultimate emptiness you find chasing worldly things.
So the devout life isn't just demanding, it's ultimately more fulfilling.
That's Law's powerful argument. It's a compelling vision.
It really is. But, as often happens, the story doesn't end there. Wesley and Law didn't stay perfectly aligned, did they?
No, they didn't. Their paths definitely diverged later on. A key factor was Law's increasing interest in mysticism, specifically the writings of Jakob Böhme.
Böhme, the German mystic.
That's the one. Wesley felt Law's embrace of Behmenism, as it was called, created a significant new barrier between them. Law's focus shifted.
Shifted towards more inward, perhaps more esoteric ideas.
Exactly. And this led to direct disagreements.
Yeah.
In 1756, Wesley actually wrote a letter to Law.
Criticizing him.
Yes, outlining his objections not just to Law specifically, but to mystical writers more generally.
What were Wesley's main points?
He had a few key concerns. He felt they lacked a proper understanding of the visible church, the community of believers.
Okay. What else?
He thought they tended to undervalue the outward means of grace, things like, communion, baptism, public worship, things Wesley saw as vital.
So too much focus on the internal, not enough on the external practices.
That was Wesley's critique. And crucially, they differed on the doctrine of justification by faith, how a person is made right with God.
Those are pretty fundamental theological differences.
They really are. And Wesley's criticism seemed to have become, even stronger over time. There's a journal entry from 1764 where he talks quite pointedly about their differing sentiments on the church, the means of grace, and justification. He clearly felt Law's later path neglected aspects of faith Wesley believed were essential.
How did Law take all this from someone who had admired him so much?
Apparently not very well at all. Reports suggest he dismissed Wesley's 1756 letter pretty harshly, called it something like a juvenile composition of emptiness and pertness.
Ouch. So he felt misunderstood, or maybe attacked?
Probably both. Law even wrote a dialogue specifically taking aim at Methodist doctrines he disliked. Such things like what he saw as an overemphasis on faith without works, or a view of Christ's righteousness being only outwardly imputed, and also the Calvinistic ideas of absolute election and reprobation that were present in some Methodist circles.
So the mentor ended up actively opposing some core ideas of the movement he inadvertently helped to parent.
It's a fascinating and somewhat sad turn of events, a real parting of the ways on some key theological points.
Absolutely. But despite all that later disagreement, the initial impact, especially of a serious call, seems undeniable.
Oh, completely. It's crucial not to let the later disputes overshadow that earlier formative influence. Wesley himself never completely repudiated the book.
Really, even after all the criticism.
Even quite late in life, not long before Law actually died, Wesley still referred to a serious call with immense respect. He called it a treatise which will hardly be excelled, either for beauty of expression or for justness and depth of thought.
That's high praise, especially considering their differences.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It shows that even though their theological paths diverge significantly, especially on things like justification, and Wesley's emphasis on instantaneous conversion, which Law wasn't keen on the book itself, retained a powerful hold on Wesley.
So wrapping this up, even with those later theological splits, Law's early influence, driven by a serious call, was fundamentally important for Wesley.
Foundational, I'd say.
Yes.
Wesley's theology obviously grew and changed, particularly after Aldersgate. But that initial fire, that powerful push towards a life of practical, total, wholehearted devotion to God.
That came significantly from Law.
Unquestionably. A serious call provided so much of that early impetus and framework. It really set the stage for Wesley's life work and, by extension, for Methodism itself.
Okay, so the big takeaway for you, our listener, is really this. William Law's A Serious Call was a profoundly formative text for John Wesley.
It shaped his early intense pursuit of Christian perfection, giving him a practical blueprint for a life lived entirely for God.
And that impact echoed through Methodism, even though Wesley and Law later parted ways theologically.
Exactly. The aha moment here, I think, is grasping how much that emphasis on lived, practical, everyday Christianity, which is such a hallmark of Methodism, really has deep roots in Law's demanding vision.
It wasn't just about belief, but about action, intention, the whole of life.
Right.
So, here's a final thought for you to consider. How does that idea integrating your deepest values or faith into the nitty-gritty details of your daily life, as Law pushed Wesley to do, how does that resonate with you? Is that separation between the sacred and secular helpful, or is there power in trying to bridge it?
Maybe even picking up A Serious Call itself could be insightful. It's still a challenging read today.
A thought to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.